Eli 5. How did planes know exactly where to go before GPS was invented? Since this is explain like I'm 5 and everyone is explaining like an adult, here it goes. Little radios are all over the place and you can listen to the radio and fly towards it. When you get there you listen to the next radio and fly towards it. Imagine if I turned on Paw Patrol on your iPad on full volume. You could find it anywhere in the house. I could walk you around the neighborhood with just playing Paw Patrol out in front of you. Planes did that with radios. Cockpit crews used to include a navigator, who would calculate position via maps. Dead Reckoning, later the LORAN radio system. Landmarks, both physical and radio. Also, with certain flight paths, there was even celestial navigation used, navigating using the stars. Landmarks are actually still used a decent amount, especially in non-commercial settings, with the first navigation method taught in flight school being completely visual. Most section charts, basically maps, will show most of these landmarks, including the extents of cities and towns and any large visual features, stadiums, large buildings, major geographic features, etc. They winged it. I'll see myself out. In all seriousness, compasses, landmarks, speed and time. Don't forget celestial navigation still being taught as a backup to air crews. Automated celestial nav systems figured into numerous cruise missile designs as well as Lockheed's A-12 and SR-71. Amazing thing is those automated systems worked during daylight as well as after sunset. The earliest planes flew low and slow enough that they'd use a compass and landmarks. The next major improvement was the use of beacons and radar, both of which could wirelessly transmit positioning info to planes if they were within range. Map and compass. When you fly you first plot a flight plan wherein you would, plot which heading you are taking to reach your destination. Most of these about radio beacons and maps and Dead Reckoning are absolutely correct. Also, in the very early days, they tended to just follow the roads. Also, pilots were known to swoop down and read street signs and welcome to town signs. Compass readings, ground speed and time. Figure out everything on a map before you take off and then call into the tower when you get close, assuming the towers have radar. Otherwise map and identifiable landmarks. In the western US they used to put huge cement arrows in the ground that pointed at the next arrow. Pilots would use these waypoints to get where they were going. It's my understanding most planes don't use GPS. Being up in the air instead of down on the ground changes how GPS calculates position and it can be wrong. So they still use radio tower beacons and radar to determine their position in the air. Basically there are beacons all over the world that mark out a road network in the air and planes try to follow that. In the early days they carried sextants. There's a story about a Pan Am plane that flew around the world trying to New York, because the government needed the plane. They used sextants to get where they're going. It was an awesome story about a seaplane. See that star over there? Follow it and keep going straight. TACAN navigation provides aircraft with bearing and range to a fixed point, usually a TACAN station. By knowing where the stations are located and your bearing and range to the station, you can fix your position quite easily. They didn't. They only went approximately where to go and figured it out when they got close. They didn't. Inertial reference systems drift, and if you can't update form ground stations flying over oceans, then you just did a best guess. The accuracy oscillates around an 84-minute period. Not going to explain why, but it is interesting, but overall drifts away. Once the computer or the pilots can get a pair of measurements from known sources on the ground, the position is updated. These days exactly the same principle runs things Dead Reckoning, but updated from the much more accurate GPS. Doesn't stop the computer tuning radio beacons on the ground to validate GPS data. Well, here's a little story from my mom. In the 1940s-50s they lived in the Midwest and my dad got his pilot's license in the Army Air Corporation. On weekends they'd borrow the company Cessna and take short trips from one state to the next to visit friends. The main airports were fine, but some of the smaller towns would move their landing strips around from one season to the next. My mom said the one thing that never moved was the cemeteries, so if you marked on the map where the town cemeteries were you could pretty easily navigate point to point as you made your way across the country. Eli 5 answer is gyroscopes. Before the plane takes off we enter the exact long, lat, ILO into a computer, that syncs that information with a gyroscope. As the plane moves the gyroscope tries to recenter. This measurement is then translated to how far the plane moved. The time needed for the before takeoff sync is about 15 minutes. Predetermined flight plans, cars drive on the road in their own lanes, planes do the exact same thing but in the air. In the 1930s, a series of lights were set up in the western US for pilots to home in on when flying at night. Some of these lights were still operational in the 70s. There were also a series of concrete arrows set in the ground that pilots could determine their position and direction to the next waypoint. Some of HASA still exist. Pilots would use maps and computers that were a kind of slide rule. They relied on precise orders and communication, and also a real-time work product. It was hard work that required doing calculations on paper. Just like you don't need a map to find your way home from school, planes didn't need GPS to find their destination. They just followed the birds. I remember reading about a bush pilot flying north from Alberta in the early days of aviation. As he had flown the route many times before, he knew that generally, if he lit his cigar shortly after takeoff, by the time he had smoked it to the nub he would be nearing his destination. In the 1960s my father and grandfather, who flew a private plane, invented and got a patent on a product to help private small plane pilots know their location. They called it the G&S plotter. It was reasonably successful with private pilots. I still have one. I saw a video once about the giant concrete arrows that were used in the USA to direct mail-carrying plane in the right direction. Some can still be found in remote areas. Easy to Google if you want to see some pictures. Eli 5 Why don't hemorrhoids and other anal sores regularly get infected by the inherent bacteria they are exposed to? The long answer was explained by other commenters, so here's the short answer. They used landmarks, radio signals, or light signals like flares or lights on the ground. Also, for the most part, planes didn't have the capability to fly at cruising altitudes of 25,000–35,000 feet in the air, cause they lacked the whole ability to compress air and whatnot inside a cabin, hence why many pilots wore oxygen masks, so that prop helped with ground visibility. How did we find our way before sat-nav? We used a map and our brains. I believe at one point, they used to have giant arrows in the ground, though it probably wasn't the main guidance. No, seriously. Look it up. Sometimes you don't want to be a natural disaster and you just want to hunt whales. Happens to everyone. When I was flying in the 80s we used maps, compasses and VORS VHF omnidirectional radio beacons. The Germans used radio beams to navigate. The receiver gives a tone, so you follow the loudest signal noise. British radio engineers used to bend them by counterbeams to make them bomb the wrong area. Before GPS, one had to manually calculate longitude and latitude as per navigating a ship. ONI had a done in the top of the fuselage to enable the use of a sextant. At night one used stars to navigate using the sextant as well. Height was by altimeter. In wartime pilots got lost, so air forces had master navigators to lead the pack, keeping in touch by signal lamps.